a rabbi dies and arrives at the gates of heaven. As he gets to the gates, he sees a taxi driver he knows from his community. They say hello while they're both standing there waiting for the angel to review their files. First, the angel calls the taxi driver forward. "Welcome," he says. "You've done very well. We've prepared a beautiful mansion for you overlooking the heavenly gardens." The taxi driver is stunned. "A mansion? Wow." Then the rabbi steps forward. The angel hands him a small set of keys and says, "You'll be staying in this modest little cottage just over there." The rabbi looks shocked. "Wait a second," he says. "I was a rabbi for 40 years. I taught Torah every day. I give shiurim every week. I dedicated myself to my community." And he drove a taxi. The angel says, "Yes, we know." The rabbi says, "So how does the taxi driver get a mansion and I get a cottage?" The angel explains, "You have to understand how we measure things up here. When you gave shiurim, people mostly fell asleep. But when he drove his taxi, everyone prayed." Of course, it's a joke. But what's interesting about that joke is the taxi driver isn't rewarded for what he did, but for the impact he had on people. When the Torah speaks of Shabbat in the Aseret HaDibrot, both in Parshat Yitro, which we read a few weeks ago, and in Vayakhel-Pekudei, which of course is in Devarim, where Moshe reprises the Aseret HaDibrot, the Ten Commandments, it uses the formula Sheshit Yamim Ta'avod, 6 days you shall work. This is work as an active pursuit. Yet in this week's Parsha in Vayakhel, the words change to Sheshet Yamim Ta'aseh Melacha, 6 days work shall be done. This is now passive. Not you shall work, but the work shall be done. So of course the question is, why the change? Why in this week's Parsha? I think exploring this question provides deep answers to understanding who we are and how we're supposed to live. So in Parshat Bereshit, we're told, "Imilu et haaretz v'chivshuha," fill the earth and bring it under your control. In Judaism, we have a responsibility to engage the world, build the world and improve the world. Therefore, developments in technology, medicine, travel and communication can actually be holy pursuits if they are developed to help improve people's lives and, of course, are used in the right way, for the positive. Work and endeavour are part of Hashem's design of creation. Therefore, when the Torah mentions Shabbat as part of society and the structure of life, it describes work as active. 6 days shall you work. And this happens on a few occasions. So we've already mentioned the Aseret HaDibrot, both in Parshat Yitro and Vayakhel. We're talking about the foundations of the mitzvot, the proper structure of life. It includes society and the importance of giving others rest, our sons, our daughters, our servants, our animals. In Parshat Mishpatim, Shabbat is mentioned in the context of social justice. And therefore we have work as active again. And in Parshat Ki Tisa, when Shabbat is mentioned in context of the agricultural cycle, it's again talked about in the active way. Sheshet Yamim Ta'avod, 6 days you shall work. In terms of normative human responsibility, there is a necessity to work. And where society and the structure of life is mentioned in the Torah, it's described in its active way. 6 days you shall work. But there are 3 places in the Torah where work is described passively. In Parshat Ki Tisa, it's mentioned once again, coming straight after the instructions regarding the Mishkan. In this week's Parsha, in Vayakhel, it's talked about just before the instructions and contributions for the Mishkan. And in Sefer Vayikra, in Parsha Emor, Shabbat comes before we're introduced to all the Moadim, all the festivals. Each time, in those cases, it's talked about in the passive. Sheshet Yamim Ta'aseh Melacha, 6 days work shall be done. In other words, when the Torah talks about Shabbat in terms of the functioning of society as a whole, it says 6 days you shall work. This is because the Torah is emphasizing our human responsibility to act. However, once the Torah talks about Shabbat with regard to holiness, in terms of the Mishkan and in terms of the Chagim, it talks about work passively. 6 days work shall be done. The Midrash in Tanhuma tells us that Hashem created the world so he could have a dwelling place in the lower realms. In other words, our goal is to create a dwelling place for the Shekhinah, which means elevating ourselves spiritually. The Lubavitcher Rebbe, Rav Menachem Mendel Schneerson, explains that work should be something that we do, but not something that consumes a person. One should engage in work, but not become absorbed or defined by it. In other words, when discussing holiness, the Torah subtly reminds us that work is not the ultimate source of our lives or our identity. It is something we do, not who we are. There is a very powerful message specifically delivered in this week's Parsha. You see, Rashi explains that the assembly of the people that we're talking about in this week's Parsha took place the day after Yom Kippur. In other words, the day after Moshe had come down from Sinai with the second Luchot, and we had been forgiven for Het HaEgel. And this is very important. The Rambam in Hilchot Avodah Zarah explains that idolatry started with the acknowledgement of intermediaries. In other words, we know Hashem made the sun and the moon and the stars. And it was a way of honouring Hashem to also honour the sun, the moon and the stars. However, it started as honouring Hashem, but eventually people ended up worshipping the intermediaries. The sin of Het HaEgel was not replacing Hashem. It was creating an intermediary, the Egel, which quickly became confused with the source, with Hashem himself. 6 days' work shall be done is reminding us that mankind is not sustained by his own efforts, but through Hashem's bracha. Our work merely provides a natural channel for this bracha, and we must remember that it is no more than a channel. In other words, we're not allowed to do nothing. We're partners with Hashem. We have to be active. But once we've made that channel for bracha, we've done our bit. Excessive preoccupation with business and the material world is a form of idolatry. If we work excessively because we believe it's our hard work that brings success, it's our money that brings security, it's our career that defines who we are, we're worshipping the intermediary. This is the mistake of Het HaEgel. Ultimately, everything comes from one source, Hashem. Yes, we have to put in effort. Our work creates a natural channel for the bracha from Hashem. However, it should not be excessive. Therefore, we're told 6 days work shall be done. It should not define us. Externally, we should work diligently. However, internally, we should remain attached to Torah. The secular may occupy a significant amount of our time, but it should not preoccupy us. Becoming too obsessed with work is a lack of emunah. Working excessively suggests that it is the intermediary, the work itself, which brings success and not Hashem. This is Het HaEgel, and it's why the lesson is here. Just after we have been forgiven for Het HaEgel, Moshe has come down with the second set of Luchot, the tablets. We've had Yom Kippur. We're reminded that the antidote to this sin is Shabbat. It's interesting, there is a pasuk in Tehillim, says, Yagia kapecha ki tochel, you will eat from the toil of your hands. But it says the toil of your hands, not your neshama, not your soul. What you do does not define who you are. So, of course, famously, we have in this week's Parsha Shabbat, as we're discussing, before the contributions to the Mishkan. And Rashi brings down and says the reason Shabbat is mentioned here before the Mishkan is that we should know that we do not break Shabbat in order to build the Mishkan. And in fact, based upon this juxtaposition of the themes of Shabbat and the Mishkan, Chazal learn, as they bring down in the Gemara in Shabbat 49 Amud Bet, that the very definition of the activities prohibited on Shabbat is determined by the task connected with the construction of the Mishkan. One of the reasons given for this is that holy time, represented by Shabbat, supersedes holy space, which is represented by the Mishkan. We can understand this. Time is the only finite resource we have. We can make money, and we can lose money, and we can make money again. I'm not negating the importance of friendships, but we make friends and sometimes we can lose a friend or drift apart from a friend, but we can make another friend. But we cannot make more time. We have our 120 years and that's it. Therefore, the single biggest determining factor of success in our lives is how we use time. We can choose to open a sefer and learn, or we can open an app on our phone and scroll. It's up to us. This is why today, as we mark Shabbat HaChodesh for this Shabbos, the first mitzvah given to the Jewish people was counting of time, because mastery of the time will determine all our other successes. I'm always very taken, profoundly, with a Gemara in Shabbat in 31 Amud Aleph. It's a famous Gemara. It tells us the questions that we're going to be asked when we go up to Shemayim, were we fair in business, etc. But one of the questions we're going to be asked is, did you make time for Torah study? And I think it's profound, because you would have thought the question should be, did you study Torah? That's the question. No, that's not the question we're asked. Did you make time to study Torah? Because it's what we make time for and give time for that's so important, because it is our only finite resource. So we have an idea that holy time supersedes holy space. But I think there's something else as well. The Gemara in Brachot in 57 Amud Bet tells us that Shabbat is a taste of the world to come. So you say, well, how is Shabbat a taste of the world to come? It's a physical day. We go to shul and we come home and we have lunch and, we do some learning as well. And we go back to shul for mincha. And how is it a taste of the world to come? Because this world is a world of becoming. That is why we're never satisfied. The world is wired like that. It's in the fabric of creation. We strive, we work, we grow to become the best versions of ourselves in all facets of our lives that we can be. But Olam Haba, the world to come, that's a world of being. There's no more striving, no more working, no more growing. And for one day on Shabbat, we stop becoming, we stop creating, and we spend one day just being. That is the whole point of the Malachot. People say turning on a light switch isn't work. What are you talking about? It's not work. It's about creating. We don't create. We just accept the world as it is for one day. That's why you can set a time switch, because then you've done that before Shabbat. It's not something you're acting on Shabbat, but on Shabbat we just be. We accept the world as it is. Therefore, when the Torah tells us that one cannot break Shabbat to build the Mishkan, what is the Torah telling us? Even when you build the holiest physical project in history, the Mishkan, your identity is not defined by labor, what you do, but by Shabbat, who you are. It is not just that holy time is more important than holy place. It is also that Shabbat, being who you are, is more important than becoming what you do. We live in a world where we define people by what they do. It's often the first question someone asks when they meet you. What do you do for a living? And we will judge someone based on their answer. I'm a doctor. I'm a lawyer. I'm a garbage man. We'll change how we feel about a person. Shabbat reminds us that who you are does not depend on human productivity. The Shem Mishmol, Rav Shmuel Bornstein, says something amazing. He explains that there are two frameworks of Shabbat. So if you go to Parshat Yitro, you go to the first of the Aseret Debrot, the first of the Ten Commandments in Parshat Yitro, we're told, in 6 days Hashem made the heavens and the earth and the sea and all that's in them, and he rested on the seventh day. This describes Shabbat as the culmination of the 6 work days. This is Shabbat as testimony to Hashem as creator, who made the world in 6 days and stopped on the seventh. But in Parshat Vayakhel-Pekudei, in Sefer Devarim, where Moshe reprises the Aseret HaDibrot, creation's not mentioned. We're told to remember that we were slaves in Egypt and Hashem took us out with a strong hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, Hashem has commanded us to keep Shabbat. This is Shabbat as the impetus for the rest of life. Because Hashem took us out of Egypt and we became his people, we now have the opportunity to live as Jews, to be Kohanim of the world. So testifying to Hashem as creator of the world, the 6 days of work come first and then Shabbat. But when it comes to our own experience as Jews, Shabbat comes first. Hashem gave us the freedom to be Jews and live as Jews, which is personified ultimately by Shabbat. And then we have the 6 working days. And this actually mirrors the human experience. Because Adam and Chava were created on the 6th day. They were created on Friday. Therefore, their first full day on earth was Shabbat. The 6 days of work came after. This is the lessons of 6 days work shall be done. Our work does not define us. We're primarily spiritual beings. Therefore, the first question we should ask is the question of Shabbat. Who do I want to be? It is the answer to that then informs our 6 working days. Given who I want to be, what should I do? The Rambam brings down, the non-Jewish nations of the world call the days of the week days. So Sunday means sun's day. Monday means the moon's day. But we don't do that. We call the days of the week Yom Rishon, Yom Sheni, Yom Shlishi. 1 day after Shabbat, 2 days after Shabbat, 3 days after Shabbat. We define our entire working week around Shabbat. Why? Because first of all, we decide who we want to be. And that informs the other 6 days of what we should do. If I want to be a person who helps people, maybe I should be a doctor. If I want to be a philanthropist, someone who funds good causes, maybe I should be in business. If I want to be a person who brings joy to the world, maybe I should be a chef or an entertainer. If I want to be a person who gives, I'm motivated to volunteer. If I want to be a person who's connected to Hashem, I'm motivated to go to shul. If I don't want to be seen as a grumpy person, I should be careful what I say. We live in a world where people decide what they want to do before they decide who they want to be. It's the wrong way round. This is the message of Shabbat. This is the message at the beginning of this week's Parsha. This lesson is underpinned with Shabbat HaChodesh. When we're given the first mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh, we're told that we count the months from Nisan. Why? So, because we know that Rosh Hashanah is in Tishrei, but that's the beginning of the physical new year. It's the actual date the world was created, and the first of Tishrei is the creation of mankind. So we date the years, we change years in Tishrei, the physical new year, because that's historically accurate. The world was created, and then we date the first day of creation as the creation of mankind, because that is the whole purpose of creation. And so every year we change the year in Tishrei. However, the first month is Nisan. We count from Nisan because that's the spiritual new year. Nisan is the month when the Jewish mission started as a people, as Klal Yisrael. We were given the first mitzvah of Rosh Chodesh to count the first of Nisan. It's also when Kiddushin took place. We were betrothed to Hashem through Korban Pesach in the month of Nisan. Our Nisuin, our marriage, then comes at Har Sinai, which is why we have this count. One of the reasons for the count of the Omer from Pesach up to Shavuot. A lot of people view this 7-week period as one big Chol HaMoed. So our mission is primarily a spiritual mission. And therefore the counting of the months is from the spiritual new year, which is Nisan. In Parsha Bereshit, Hashem told us to conquer the earth. Therefore, we have a responsibility to work, to strive, and to contribute to the world. When the Torah is emphasizing society and the functioning of humanity, it highlights this striving. So 6 days show you work. In the Aseret HaDibrot, the foundations of society. In Mishpatim, focusing on social justice. In Ki Tisa, when we're talking about the agricultural cycle. But when Shabbat is mentioned directly with regard to holiness, the building of the Mishkan, the cycle of the Moadim, the festivals, it says 6 days work shall be done. We have to put the effort in to create a channel for the bracha that Hashem gives us. But we are primarily spiritual beings with a spiritual mission, to create a dwelling place for the Shekhinah in this world. Who we are is much more important than what we do. Moreover, while we should put effort into our work, excessive work is a form of idolatry. It is chet ha'egel, emphasizing the intermediary, not the source. Ultimately, it all comes from Hashem. Work creates a channel for bracha, but ultimately, we know where it comes from. The Midrash in Tanchuma on this week's Parsha, which Rashi brings down, says that Moshe has brought the building blocks of the Mishkan, and his job is to erect it. But there's a problem. The building blocks and the assorted construction pieces are all too heavy for Moshe to do it on his own. Hashem tells him to make an attempt, and miraculously the Mishkan is erected. But the message is clear. In the face of a seemingly impossible task, our job is to do our best. Hashem will take care of the outcome. The inputs are up to us. We have to put the effort in. But the outcomes, they're up to Hashem. Judaism does not reject doing. On the contrary, Judaism requires doing. Doing, however, must grow out of being. First define who you want to be. Let that inform what you do. We often ask our children, what do you want to do when you grow up? The lesson is that the real question we should be asking is, who do you want to be?